governments have been basically tapping phones for dozens of years, but spyware does something different. It takes control of your phone and monitors everything you put in there.
Follow the money.
This is the podcast of the European investigative newsroom Follow the Money. I'm your host, Emma de Chatinier, recording from Brussels. And as always, I'm joined by Follow the Money reporter and my co-host Alexander Fanta in Vienna. Hi, Alex.
Morning.
In this episode, we're looking at how European money is fueling the global spyware industry. These surveillance tools can infiltrate your phone, track your movements, and read your messages. They're marketed as technology to fight crime, but they've also been used to target journalists, activists, and political opponents. Despite those risks, the European Union is giving millions of euros to companies behind spyware. Taxpayer money is used to expand a shadowy market of digital surveillance. Alex, today we're talking about spyware, and spyware is a topic that you know a lot about as well. How did you get into this topic?
Well, I've covered spyware for years. I mean, there was a major scandal a couple of years back, spyware called Pegasus. Governments across the world were found to have hacked the phones of journalists, lawyers, dissidents. So there was basically surveillance with a clear political motive. And the surprising thing was, it was found that it didn't just apply to authoritarian governments, but it also applied to European democratic governments who were found to have hacked people. So this was a major scandal. But the surprising thing was that there was very, very little follow-up. So in fact, the spyware industry is growing in Europe and beyond, and it's even enjoying a boom. And all the scandals have done little to stop that.
And today we're joined by someone who can tell us everything about this topic. We're joined by Greek journalist Vas Panagiotopoulos, who's based in Australia. Welcome, Vas.
Hello, both. Thank you for having me on the podcast.
Well, we're happy to have you here. And Vas, you've described yourself as a real spyware geek. You've written dozens of articles about this. And where does your interest for this topic come from?
So a few years ago, while I was still based in Greece, we had a massive spyware scandal. So basically, the country's entire political and business elite, alongside journalists and others, were placed under surveillance. So I work with a press freedom organization called Reporters Without Borders, and we defended journalists who were victims of spyware. And we also defended journalists who covered the scandal, and they were on the receiving end of abusive lawsuits. So I was shocked that this could be happening in Greece, but I was intrigued. So what are these tools? Who are the people who sell them and use them? So I spent hours researching in my little rabbit hole. So in addition to my journalism, I'm at Deakin University here in Melbourne, where I am based, and I look at this industry globally. So how it operates, its supply chains, government procurement, its political influence. And specifically for this piece I wrote for Follow the Money, I looked into who funds it.
Before we dive into the exact details of your story that you did for Follow the Money, I think it's good for us to sort of take a step back and understand the bigger picture on spyware. Because what exactly is spyware and what is it used for?
Spyware is a software that secretly breaks into your mobile phone and takes control of your device. Basically, it can activate your camera or your microphone without you knowing. It can access your encrypted chats, so on WhatsApp, on Signal, and it could also geolocate you. This is primarily used by intelligence agencies and law enforcement. And the main use is to combat terrorism and serious crimes. However, it has also become a means of repression. So it can stifle democracy, monitor critics, journalists, activists.
And I think that's also something your story really shows, that spyware is very much a topic of interest within the EU as well. And could you briefly share what exactly you discovered in the story that you wrote for Follow the Money?
So in a nutshell, I found that European Union funds, alongside national government funds in countries like Italy and Spain, were channeled directly to commercial spyware firms in recent years. So the amounts range from a few thousand to a few million euros and have benefited major players in the market. I'm not suggesting that any part of the funds was specifically used to develop spyware capabilities. It's a bit like giving money to a criminal for non-criminal activities.
The core of what you're saying is that if there's EU money going to these companies and they also produce spyware, the EU might be thinking it's funding, defense products or like a systems analysis software that checks a network for vulnerabilities. But in the end, they're funding a company that's doing spyware.
Yeah, any funding for this powerful technology linked to human rights abuses and national security risks, especially from public funds, should be tightly monitored. It's a systemic failure. Taxpayers end up financing tools of repression and political manipulation.
I think that's an important point, is that, governments have been basically tapping phones for dozens of years, maybe 100 years even. But spyware does something different. It takes control of your phone and monitors everything you put in there. So that might be personal, private photos. That might be stuff like notes you were taking. It's not just tapping a phone. It's basically intruding the entire private life of a person. And it's also another thing that's makes spyware so controversial, is that to do so, the government or whoever the spyware maker has to deliberately leave a security flaw, a vulnerability open to access, a device. So the government might know there's a deep security flaw within WhatsApp, for instance, or within the Android operating system of your phone, and it decides not to tell anyone, so it can't be fixed, and anyone else can also use the same flaw. So in a sense, it's basically two problems. It's both that too much information gets accessed, but it's also that the way to access that information is itself creates deep insecurity and leaves open a massive flank for any kind of actor to tap into phones.
Yeah, I mean, essentially that is the problem, is to where our systems are vulnerable and who has access to these vulnerabilities. And this is like a huge sort of like technical as well as like political and geopolitical issue.
When you explain this, I'm wondering, does the company behind my phone software, so Android or Apple, I'm sure they also know about these vulnerabilities, right? So are they not in a position to do something about it then?
I suppose the vulnerabilities they know about, then they will issue like an update to fix your phone. But if they don't know about them, then that's when this whole situation erupts. And then, so when they don't know about them, this is precisely when you have this sort of cases.
I mean, the spyware industry, right, has produced this massive shadow market of, hackers and, kind of bit dodgy security researchers who find these flaws. And instead of reporting them to the companies so that they can be fixed, they sell them to spyware makers and to governments so they can be exploited to hack people's phones. So in a sense, spyware feeds this massive market of illicit hacking and doesn't do anything to, kind of improve everyone's security.
But so you're basically saying then that governments hire hackers to exploit the vulnerabilities in operating systems?
Yeah. What governments do is they say, well, we need this security flaw, otherwise we can't operate our spyware. Or, this might also come from the spyware maker. And so either of them gets in touch and says, well, we would be willing to pay any number of money, maybe €1 million, maybe more, for a security flaw that we can exploit so we can hack phones.
So one part of the controversy is the way that spyware operates, but the other part is by who and for what reason spyware is used, right?
Yes, we have also examples of grave human rights harms. For instance, Saudi journalist and dissident Jamal Khashoggi was murdered in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul in 2018. And basically, later it was found out that his close circle basically was placed under surveillance with Pegasus by NSO Group. So this is like a very good example of how this technology can lead to really grave harms. Another example is a UAE human rights defender, Ahmed Mansour, who was repeatedly targeted also with Pegasus. He was imprisoned and tortured. I think he's still in prison, by the way. So effectively, this is a technology that is very little regulated. So it is very tempting to be abused by those in power. to control dissidents and opponents. And I think this is the very essence, that this is like a formidable means of control, essentially.
I think one point is crucial to make is that spyware is built on illegality, because spyware requires to find a security flaw that is then illegally exploited to enter someone's phone. And then even if governments legitimately or feel they legitimately use spyware, they are building on that illegality. And I think that is something that's very hard to reconcile with the law and also with the human rights of the people involved.
But is there an alternative?
That's the problem. There isn't. Very often when we speak about, accessing encrypted chats, there is no other way to get into that person's phone. So it becomes a trade-off for the security forces, the authorities involved. They're saying, well, what we're doing here is based on breaking the law, but there's no other way of doing it. So we have to do it because we have to get into that person's phone to prevent, terrorism or major crime. The problem is once you start doing that, once that tool becomes available, it becomes very seductive for certain governments to use it for other things. That's why we see authoritarian governments like the Hungarian government of Viktor Orban, using it to systematically break into journalists' phones to see where their sources are coming from. So there's a fundamental tension in there. Any kind of problem about the rule of law and how judicial and police authorities are using surveillance becomes heightened and crystallized into this focal point of spyware, because it's such a powerful tool.
So the EU gives money to companies that produce spyware. In fact, they're giving millions of euros to companies that produce spyware. But why would it do that in the first place? What's like that money meant to do?
I mean, it's defense, it's research, it's like regional development, is a European Social Fund. So it's a whole sort of like big like EU programs, but essentially the like in the specifics, you could also have like space for like surveillance sort of operations. So, and these are like, also like law enforcement agencies are involved. So, and there's, also like a constant need to actually develop like law enforcement, like surveillance capabilities. So I'm not entirely sure that the EU is completely like unaware of where this money is being channeled.
But is one of the problems the opacity of EU funding, so that we don't exactly know what what the EU's funding it will for?
Maybe, they should like continue receiving these funds, but there should be control. So it's all about the checks and balances, basically all these oversight mechanisms that currently appear not to be functioning or appear not to be in place at all.
And Vas, in your research, you looked at various companies that produce spyware and get EU funding. And why did you think that those specific companies that you looked at are controversial?
For instance, there's an Israeli-US surveillance company called Verin Systems. Basically, they coordinated a 15 million seventh framework project between 2014 and 2018, which was 70% funded by the EU. And this program was basically a voice identification platform for law enforcement. Now, on Verin, Amnesty International has accused Verin's Israeli subsidiary of supplying communications interception gear to South Sudan. So, and Amnesty said it was concerned given the country's record of rights abuses. Moreover, an investigation by Privacy International in 2014 found that Verin supplied surveillance systems capable of tapping phone and internet traffic to Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, countries that are known for authoritarianism and press repression. So basically, although the very project that the EU funded wasn't like actually spyware per se, but it was like completely adjacent to like surveillance sort of operations. But we also see that the same company was somehow sort of providing these tools to questionable regimes. So that's precisely the key to this whole conversation, that this is like it's a pipeline, essentially. It's
the same companies that get EU money that are also exporting intrusive surveillance technology to authoritarian countries. That's what we're facing here, yeah.
And I think like another example that I think is really important here is that the EU awarded a 60,000 contract to France's Nexa Technologies. So the contract was described as involving a security device, but this is important because Nexa was part of the Intellexa Alliance. It's basically a network of companies involved in developing and selling spyware. And the alliance was linked to the wider Intellexa consortium. And this is important because the Intellexa consortium was sanctioned by Washington in 2024 for using Predator to monitor US officials, journalists, and policy experts. Essentially, Nexa was later revealed to have sold Predator spyware to repressive regimes, including Egypt, Vietnam, and Madagascar. So, like this is like a good example of how like these are the same companies that are elsewhere sort of sanctioned.
The EU usually does these evaluation reports and any funding they disperse. And I really would be curious to read some of these evaluation reports because they must be quite scathing. You fund a company to do some security research, you get sanctioned in the US for producing dangerous surveillance software. What gives?
And Alex, what has Brussels then actually done so far to tackle this problem?
Yeah, so the EU has done the European Media Freedom Law, which kind of addresses one small part of this wider problem, namely, trying to make it illegal to hack journalists to attain their sources, which is a good thing. But the wider problem, the stuff we talked about earlier, it has not been really addressed. So it's still possible for governments to buy this software, to export it to authoritarian governments. And it's still, these companies, as Vas research has showed, they'll still be able to access EU funds. So in many ways, this problem has been quite, more or less ignored by Brussels because it's just too difficult to tackle. I don't know.
In the wake of all these scandals, the European Parliament formed an inquiry committee in 2022, that adopted a really, really good report in 2023 and a set of recommendations. And then there was a European Parliament resolution, but still the European Commission hasn't done anything.
And then who would you say is actually the one ignoring the problem and who has an interest in maintaining the status quo instead of regulating more?
Essentially, these are the main users of these tools are governments and, intelligence agencies, law enforcement agencies. And, they just want free hand to be able to continue to use these technologies. So there's no political will to do the dirty work and put pressure on member states to actually adopt any rules.
What I find interesting is that under the Biden administration, the US did actually restrict how much the government can use commercial spyware. That surprised me because I have this idea that in the US, spyware is in general a lot less controversial than in Europe. So why did the US make those quite rigid changes?
So the US wanted to restrict commercial spyware because in its eyes, it poses national security and counterintelligence risks. So, for example, 50 State Department officials were placed under surveillance in various different countries. Now, interestingly, the US doesn't need to buy spyware on the market because they have their own in-house solutions. So, just reminding you of the Snowden revelations and NSA. So, the US is one of these key nations where they have really sort of increasingly very, very well developed capabilities. So, but perhaps most interestingly, the US wants to restrict commercial spyware because essentially it compromises key US technology. So think of Apple's iOS operating system, think of Google's Android or Meta's WhatsApp. So these are American technologies. So the US doesn't want third parties to be compromising their technology. But also it wanted to gain the higher moral ground. It doesn't want to be using the same tools that have been associated with harms to human rights abuses elsewhere. In 2024, I made an important discovery. I discovered a contract of a spyware vendor called Paragon Solutions with immigrations and customs enforcement in the United States. This is important because the US wanted at the time to restrict the use of spyware. So immediately after my reporting, the Biden White House actually paused the contract, to my great surprise, and placed it under review.
But that was the thinking under Biden. Now under Trump, there's a certain shift in tone, isn't there?
Well, that's a very good question, Alex, because essentially so much has changed. Trump is in the White House, and the contract has been reactivated by his administration.
And Vas, in writing this whole story, what was like the one thing that surprised you most?
Well, what actually surprised me is that there's very little scrutiny and control. So basically, the European Commission did not answer our questions. They didn't provide any comment to our story. So I think that's what's really important. I think moving forward, there needs to be as we said previously, there needs to be very strict controls of all the funds flowing to these kind of companies. The only thing that could lead to change is more pressure from civil society and essentially more pressure from the general public. So part of my research is to raise awareness around these issues and actually lead to change.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today, Vas. And with that, we'll wrap up today's episode. You can find the story by Vas on ftm.eu and also in the show notes. And Alex and I will be back soon for another episode.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
You've listened to the podcast of Follow the Money. Our watchdog journalism is funded by our members. Subscribe and support European investigative journalism.